the first time Emmett Keene walked into the town of Harlan's Crossing, Texas, in the spring of 1874. He did it the way he did everything, with his jaw set like iron and his eyes telling the world he had already survived the worst it could offer, and he was not afraid to prove it could not break him again. Harlan's Crossing sat in the crease between two low hills about 40 miles southeast of San Antonio, a town that had been birthed by a cattle trail and was still being raised by it. There was a main street of packed red dirt, a general store with a sagging porch, a livery stable that smelled of hay and horse sweat, a saloon called the Copper Kettle that did better business than the church 3 doors down, and a scattering of homes fanning out behind the storefronts like the feathers on a tired bird. It was not a beautiful town, but it was alive, and in 1874 that counted for something in this part of Texas. Emmett was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, and lean in the way of a man who had known real hunger and refused to let his body forget the lesson. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw shadowed with several days of beard that he never quite let grow into a full one, as though he was always in the middle of deciding something about himself. He wore a gray shirt that had been washed 100 times, canvas trousers, worn boots, and a hat that had seen more weather than most men twice his age. He had no gun on his hip, which in this part of Texas in 1874 was the kind of thing people noticed, the same way they noticed if a man walked with a limp or carried a scar across his face. Emmett had none of those visible marks, but he carried the war inside him, packed down tight and held there by sheer stubbornness. He had ridden with the Confederate forces out of Louisiana young, barely 19 when it started, filled up with something that felt like pride at the time, and that he now understood had been a combination of ignorance and being told what to feel. He had come home to find his family's small farm half collapsed, and his father dead of a fever that no one had sent word about. He had spent 2 years drifting before he found that drifting itself had a cost he had not anticipated, and by the time he arrived in Harlan's Crossing, he was looking for something to attach himself to, though he could not have said exactly what. He took a job at the Callaway Ranch on the edge of town. Hector Callaway was a big, sunburned man in his 50s who raised longhorns and asked few questions of the men he hired, which suited Emmett exactly. The bunkhouse held 4 other hands, a Mexican man named Rodrigo who had been with Callaway for 8 years and who could read horses the way scholars read books, a quiet young man named Tobias who was 17 and trying hard to appear older, a red-bearded Irishman called Finn who told stories about Dublin that no one fully believed, and an older man named Chester who mostly kept to himself and smelled of pipe tobacco. Emmett settled in among them without ceremony, took the bunk nearest the window, and went to work. The work was honest and physical, and it kept his mind from the places it liked to wander at night. He spent his days in the saddle, moving cattle through dry grass and along creek beds, mending fences that the longhorns tested with their enormous horns, and learning the particular geography of this stretch of Texas, its arroyos and mesquite thickets, and the one stretch of good bottom land along the creek where the grass grew green and thick, and the cattle gathered in the evening like churchgoers. He was good at the work. He had always been good with his hands and with animals, and Hector Callaway noticed without making a fuss about it, which was the kind of appreciation Emmett understood best. He had been in Harlan's Crossing for about 3 weeks when he first saw Delia Maddox. She was coming out of the general store with a paper-wrapped package tucked under one arm and a list in her other hand that she was frowning at, and she walked with the particular kind of purpose that suggested she had more to do before the day was done, and she intended to do all of it. She was 24, though Emmett did not know that at the time, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a plain bonnet, and a dress the color of the sky just before dark, a deep blue that made her stand out against the dusty street. She was not the most conventionally beautiful woman Emmett had ever seen, but she had a face that was alive with intelligence and something harder to name, a quality like the creek water after rain, clear and moving and not entirely predictable. She walked past him without looking at him. He was standing at the hitching post outside the general store, working a piece of loose leather on his bridle, and she went right past him as though he was part of the post itself, which was fine, because he watched her go and then went back to his bridle and told himself very firmly that he had not watched her go. He asked Rodrigo about her that evening, keeping his voice casual enough that Rodrigo smiled behind his coffee cup. Rodrigo told him that Delia Maddox was the daughter of the late Reverend Samuel Maddox, who had come to Harlan's Crossing from Georgia about 7 years back and had died of a heart ailment 2 years ago, leaving Delia his small house near the church and his reputation for honest dealing and very little else of material value. She ran the town's small lending library, a grand title for a room at the back of the church, where she kept roughly 200 books donated over the years by various townspeople and ordered in occasionally from San Antonio. She also took in sewing and mending to pay her bills, and she taught reading twice a week to any child whose parents brought them, and once a week to 3 adults who had never had the chance to learn. She was, Rodrigo said, the kind of woman that a town depended on without quite knowing it, the kind who held things together by small, steady acts that no one made speeches about. She was also, Rodrigo added with another of those smiles, not currently being courted by anyone, a fact he mentioned with the specific casualness of a man who knows he is being helpful and is enjoying it. Emmett said nothing to that and went to bed early and lay awake for a while staring at the ceiling of the bunkhouse. The second time he encountered Delia Maddox was at the Copper Kettle Saloon on a Friday evening. He had gone in with Finn and Chester for a single drink, which was what he always allowed himself, and Delia was not there. Women of her standing did not frequent the Copper Kettle. But the saloon's owner, a wide man named Prentice, was holding court about the upcoming Founders' Day celebration that Harlan's Crossing held every June. The celebration involved a barbecue, a horse race, a dance, and a number of other festivities that the town took seriously, and Prentice was explaining that Miss Maddox had once again agreed to organize the book display and the reading corner at the celebration, which drew more participants every year. Emmett drank his beer and listened, and tried not to appear interested. He saw her properly for the first time, meaning he had a full conversation with her, at the feed store on a Tuesday morning in early May. He was picking up a sack of oats that Calloway had ordered, and she was at the counter arguing politely but very firmly with the feed store owner, a thin man named Aldous Webb, about the price of a particular kind of seed corn. She was not raising her voice. She did not need to raise her voice. She was simply presenting her argument with the clarity and precision of a woman who had been educated by a preacher father and who had spent years surrounded by books, and Aldous Webb was losing ground by inches. Emmett set down the sack he had been lifting and stood still, not because he was eavesdropping, but because the sack had been heavier than expected, and he needed a moment anyway. That was what he told himself. Aldous Webb finally conceded that the price had perhaps been set a touch high and adjusted it downward by a small but dignified margin, and Delia thanked him pleasantly and turned away from the counter with her seed corn and nearly walked directly into Emmett's chest. She stopped. He stepped back. They both said pardon at the same moment, which created a brief pause in which neither of them spoke. "I did not see you there," she said. "I was not exactly announcing myself," he said. She looked at him with those clear eyes. They were gray-green, he saw now, the color of sage after rain, and she said, "You are one of the Calloway hands." "Emmett Keene," he said. "Delia Maddox," she said, and held out her hand in a direct way that surprised him because not all women in 1874 Texas offered their hand to a stranger they had just met in a feed store. He shook it. Her grip was firm and brief and entirely businesslike. "You are from the East," she said. It was not quite a question. "Louisiana originally," he said. She nodded once, as though that explained several things she had been quietly cataloging about him, and then she said, "Good day, Mr. Keene," and carried her seed corn out of the feed store and into the bright May morning. He stood there for a moment holding his oat sack, and then Aldous Webb said from behind the counter, "She is like that with everyone." "Like what?" Emmett said. "Direct," Aldous said. "Takes some getting used to." Emmett thought that was probably an understatement and went back to the ranch and told himself he had thought about the encounter for approximately the last time. He thought about it for the next 4 days. The Founders' Day celebration was set for the 14th of June, and in the weeks leading up to it, the town of Harlan's Crossing took on a particular quality of organized bustle, like a colony of ants that had been informed company was coming. There were signs going up, and bunting being strung between the storefronts, and the blacksmith's son was seen whitewashing the fence posts along Main Street with an enthusiasm that seemed to diminish noticeably when his father came into view. Hector Calloway entered 2 horses in the race, which meant Emmett and Rodrigo spent several evenings working with the horses in question, a gray gelding named Bishop, and a chestnut mare named Persephone, who had a turn of speed that was startling when you first witnessed it. Emmett had occasion to pass the church twice during this preparation period, and both times he saw Delia through the open door of the reading room, organizing books on a long table with the focused attention of a woman who took her work seriously. Once she looked up and saw him through the door, and she lifted her chin in acknowledgement, and he touched the brim of his hat, and they both went back to what they had been doing with the slightly exaggerated concentration of 2 people pretending they had not noticed each other. On the evening of June 12th, 2 days before Founders' Day, Emmett was crossing the churchyard on his way back from the livery stable. It was a shortcut he had developed, cutting through behind the church to save 5 minutes on the walk back to the Calloway ranch, when he heard a sound that he could not immediately identify. It was a sharp, caught sound, like someone trying not to be heard. He stopped. The churchyard in the evening light was long and gold, with the grave markers casting their shadows eastward, and the old oak tree near the fence throwing shade across the corner of the yard. The church itself had a back door that stood open to let in the evening air, and it was from near that door that the sound had come. He moved around the corner of the church and found Delia Maddox standing very still in the narrow alley between the church wall and the wooden fence, her face set with determined composure, and her skirt hem, the dark blue dress again, the one he had first noticed her in, firmly caught on a large iron nail that jutted from the fence post at an angle, the kind of nail that had been driven in years ago for some long-forgotten purpose, and then left when the purpose was forgotten. She was holding a stack of books against her chest with both arms, and the nail had her skirt pulled taut so that she could not move forward without tearing it, and she could not easily reach down to free it without dropping all the books, which were apparently heavy enough and presumably precious enough that she had not wanted to set them on the ground, which was muddy from that morning's brief rain. Emmett saw all of this in about 2 seconds, and he crossed the alley in 4 steps, and he was already going down onto one knee before he had fully processed what he was doing. He went down on his knee in the mud at her feet and reached for the nail with steady hands, and it was only when he felt the damp of the mud coming through his trouser leg and felt the closeness of the ground that it hit him, the way it sometimes did, not a full memory, but the physical shadow of one, the particular sensation of kneeling, on the march down through Georgia, in the hospital tent, at his father's grave. He had knelt for all of it, and he had told himself after the last time, at his father's grave in the Louisiana mud, that he would not kneel again. That kneeling had come to mean for him the posture of defeat and grief and subjugation, and he had decided, privately and fiercely, that he was finished with all of those things. And yet here he was, on his knee in the mud of the Harlan's Crossing churchyard, working the hem of Delia Maddox's dress free from a fence nail. And the strange thing, the thing that would take him weeks to fully understand, was that it did not feel like defeat. It did not feel like grief. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something he had been pointed toward for a long time without knowing it. He freed the hem carefully, making sure the fabric did not tear, working the nail out of the weave with 2 fingers and holding the hem smooth against the wood while he did it. It took about 30 seconds. He stood back up. Delia was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Keene. I was about to set the books down in the mud." "The books looked like they deserved better than that," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "Are you all right?" she said, and the question was quiet and specific, as though she had noticed more about those 30 seconds than she intended to let on. "I am fine," he said. She nodded, and then she did something he had not expected. She shifted the books in her arms so that the stack was balanced against one hip, freeing her right hand, and she reached out and touched his arm just briefly, just at the elbow, the lightest and most passing contact, and she said, "Well, thank you nonetheless." Then she walked back around the corner of the church and into the golden evening, and Emmett stood in the alley and looked at the mud on his knee and the fence nail and thought about what had just happened, turning it over in his mind like a stone he had found that might be ordinary or might be something worth keeping. He went back to the bunkhouse and cleaned the mud from his trousers and said nothing to anyone, and Rodrigo, who noticed everything, said nothing either, which was its own kind of communication. Founder's Day arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted, and a heat that was fierce but not vicious, and the whole population of Harlan's Crossing and the surrounding ranches came into town dressed in their best clothes and carrying their appetites and their sociability. The barbecue started at noon, with a whole beef and several chickens turning over a long fire pit that the men of the town had built behind the courthouse, and the smoke went up into the blue sky like a signal. The horse race was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, and the dance would begin at sunset in the open space behind the copper kettle, where the proprietor Prentice had hung lanterns in the trees and arranged the area with benches and a platform for the musicians. Between the barbecue and the horse race, the reading corner that Delia had organized was doing a quiet but steady business at the tables she had set up under a canvas shade outside the church. She had arranged the books by subject and had placed several out open to interesting pages, and she was talking to the people who stopped by with the focused pleasure of a woman in her element, recommending one book over another, answering questions about what a particular volume contained, helping a child sound out a title on a spine. Emmett watched her from across the street for a minute, standing with a plate of barbecued beef and a cup of water, and he registered the way she lit up when she talked about the books, the way that particular corner of the celebration was alive in a different way than the rest of it. He crossed the street. She saw him coming, and there was a small rearrangement of her expression that might have been pleasure and might have been something more cautious, and she said, "Mr. Keene, are you a reader?" "I have been known to be," he said, which was true. He had read more during his years of drifting than he had ever read before, partly because books were something you could carry and partly because they were the only company that did not require him to account for himself. "What kind?" she said. "History," he said. "Some philosophy. I have a weakness for natural history, birds and plants and that kind of thing." She looked at him as though this had genuinely surprised her, and then she reached to the table and pulled out a volume and held it toward him. "This came in from San Antonio 3 months ago," she said. "It is a collection of essays on the natural history of the Southwest. It is very good. I have read it twice." He took the book and looked at the title and then looked at her. "You read it twice?" "I read everything twice," she said, as though this was simply the obvious way to engage with a book. "The first time to find out what happens, the second time to understand what it means." He did not have a ready response to that, and she seemed to know it because she smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her, not the polite version, and said, "Would you like to borrow it?" "I would," he said. "You can return it when you are done," she said. "That is the arrangement." He borrowed the book and went to watch the horse race, and Persephone the chestnut mare ran second, which Rodrigo took philosophically, and Hector Calloway took with the tight-faced dignity of a man who had been hoping for first. Bishop the Grey Gelding did not distinguish himself at all, which was not surprising to anyone who knew him well. At the dance that evening, Emmett stood at the edge of the lantern light for a while watching the fiddle player, and the accordion player filled the evening air with music that was lively enough to make even the oldest settlers tap their feet. The dance was informal and vigorous, and people of all ages participated with varying levels of skill and uniformly high levels of enthusiasm. Emmett did not dance, as a general rule. He had not danced since before the war, and he was not sure he still knew how, or more precisely, he was not sure he was ready to be the kind of man who danced at an evening celebration in a Texas town, when there were men he had served with who were dead in Georgia soil. He was working through this reasoning, which was familiar to him by now, when Delia Maddox appeared at his elbow. She was wearing a different dress this evening, pale green with a cream collar, and her hair was down from its usual pins and wound into a loose arrangement that made her look younger and less formal, and she was holding 2 cups of the lemonade that someone's wife had made and set out on a table near the musicians. She held 1 cup toward him. "You look like you are conducting a military assessment of the dance," she said. He took the cup. "I do not dance," he said. "That is a shame," she said mildly, looking at the dancers. "Do you?" he said. "I do," she said. "But I have been on my feet all day, and I was happy to have a reason to stand still." They stood together at the edge of the lantern light and drank their lemonade and watched the dancers and the dark Texas sky fill up with stars, and they talked. It was not the most remarkable conversation in the world, except that for Emmett it was. They talked about the books she had in the lending library and the ones she wished she had, and the difficulty of getting new volumes in this part of Texas, and the way the railroad, which had not yet reached Harlan's Crossing, would change that when it came. They talked about the land around here, the way the spring rains had come later than expected and what that meant for the ranches. She asked him about Louisiana, not in the careful way some people asked, dancing around the war, but directly, asking what it was like as a place, what the landscape was like, whether he missed it. He said he missed the Spanish moss on the live oaks and the way the bayou smelled at evening, which was the most honest answer he had given anyone in a long time. She said she missed Georgia, which was where she had grown up before her father had decided that Harlan's Crossing needed a preacher and moved the family here. She missed the red clay soil and the way the dogwood trees bloomed white in early spring, which she had not seen in 7 years. They talked for a long time, until the music changed to something slower and several couples moved into the dance space with a kind of settled intimacy, and Emmett became aware that the evening had moved forward considerably and he was still standing here, which was unusual for him. "I should get back," he said, which was not entirely true but was something to say. "Of course," she said. "Good night, Mr. Keene." "Good night, Miss Maddox," he said, and started toward the edge of the lamplight, and then turned back because something made him turn back and said, "I will have the book back to you within the week. It is very good." She smiled again, the real smile, and said, "Take your time. That is what the library is for." He walked back to the Callaway Ranch under a sky full of stars and thought about the way she had said that, "Take your time," and the particular warmth of it. And he thought that possibly, he was in some amount of trouble here. He returned the book in 4 days. He had read it twice because it seemed right. He returned it to the reading room in the back of the church on a Thursday afternoon, and she was there alone, sorting through a donation of books that someone had brought in, a box of volumes from a family that had moved away, a mixed collection of novels and almanacs, and a Bible with a cracked spine. She was assessing each one with the careful attention of a doctor examining patients, checking pages, checking bindings, making small notes on a piece of paper. He set the natural history book on the corner of the table and said, "I read it twice." She looked up. "What did you find the second time?" "That the author was writing as much about himself as about the plants and birds," he said. "The way he talks about the ones that survive in hard conditions. There is something personal in it." She set down the book she had been examining and looked at him with that steady, assessing gaze. "Yes," she said. "I thought that too. I thought it was a book about persistence dressed up as natural history." "That is exactly what I thought," he said. There was a beat of silence that was comfortable rather than awkward, and then she said, "Would you like another?" He said he would, and she chose for him without hesitation, pulling a volume of history about the Spanish missions in Texas from the shelf, and he took it and turned it over in his hands and said, "How do you know that is the right one?" "Because you said you like history, and because you are a man who came to Texas from somewhere else, and I think you want to understand the place," she said. "And because the author has the same quality as the natural history writer. He is trying to understand something about himself through the place he is studying." He looked at her for a moment. "You are very perceptive," he said. "I have been reading people as long as I have been reading books," she said. "It is a similar skill." He laughed, which surprised him. It was a genuine laugh, not the polite approximation he usually managed in social situations. She looked pleased at having caused it, though she did not make a show of the pleasure. He came back the following Thursday with the Spanish missions book read twice, and a specific question about one of the chapters, and she had an answer ready. And they talked about the missions for 20 minutes before he realized that she had been doing the mending she took in while they talked, her needle moving through a shirt seam with automatic precision while she engaged with the conversation. And he understood that this was probably how she worked all the time, two things at once, neither one suffering for the division of attention. After that, Thursday afternoons became a habit, though neither of them formally arranged it. He would come with a returned book and a question, and she would be there, and they would talk for somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour, and he would leave with a new book. It was orderly and sensible, and it gave him something to look forward to during the long working days of a ranch hand in the Texas summer, which was all he acknowledged to himself about what was happening. What was happening, in the honest assessment of Rodrigo, who observed it all with the patience of a man who had seen many things and was in no hurry about any of them, was that Emmett Keene was falling in love with Delia Maddox, and from what Rodrigo could see, the situation was not entirely one-sided. The summer deepened and the work on the Callaway Ranch was hard and constant, and in the evenings Emmett sat on the bunkhouse step with his book and read until the light failed. And when the light failed, he sat there a while longer, looking at the darkening sky and thinking about things he did not have words for. Finn, who was garrulous by nature, had made several attempts to draw him out about Miss Maddox, and each time Emmett had redirected the conversation with a brevity that eventually discouraged Finn without actually discouraging him, which was a fine distinction that Finn seemed comfortable occupying. In late July, the town of Harlan's Crossing had occasion to be reminded that life in this part of Texas in 1874 was not without its complications. A man named Cole Briggs, who ran a small cattle operation south of town, had a long-running dispute with Hector Callaway over the water rights to the creek that ran between their properties. The dispute was not new. It had been going on for several years, rooted in a deed that was imprecise about the boundaries, and it had flared up again because the summer had been dry enough that the creek level was low and both men needed the water for their herds. Emmett had been aware of the dispute in the background way that ranch hands were aware of their employer's business, but he came more directly into it when Callaway asked him to ride down and check on the fence line at the southern end of the property, which backed up to the contested creek section. Emmett rode down there on a Monday morning and found that two of Briggs's men had pulled down about 40 yards of fence and watered their cattle on what was technically Callaway's side of the creek. He did not confront them. He assessed the situation, noted it carefully, and rode back to report to Callaway. He told Callaway what he had seen without embellishment and without recommendation, because he had learned that adding opinion to reporting often complicated the thing rather than simplifying it. Callaway rode into town to speak with the sheriff, a deliberate and slow-spoken man named Abel Marsh, who had handled the disputes of Harlan's Crossing for 6 years with a combination of patience and firm, quiet authority. Abel Marsh spoke to both parties separately and then together, and arrived at a temporary arrangement about water access that neither man was fully satisfied with, which was the sign of a fair resolution according to Abel's own philosophy. The fence was rebuilt. The dispute subsided back into its background position. Emmett had occasion to describe this episode to Delia on the following Thursday, not as a report of trouble, but because she asked how his week had been, and he answered honestly, which was something he was finding easier to do in her company than he had expected. She listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, complete and quiet and genuinely engaged. And when he had finished, she said, "Water rights are going to be the great argument of this part of Texas for the next 50 years. The land is generous in some ways and impossible in others, and water is where it becomes impossible." "You sound like you have thought about it," he said. "My father used to say that in Georgia the argument was about land, and in Texas it would be about water, and in California it would be about both," she said. "He was a perceptive man." She spoke of her father with a clarity that acknowledged the grief without performing it, and Emmett recognized that quality because it was similar to the way he held his own losses, and he thought, not for the first time, that there was something in the way she moved through the world that was familiar to him in a deep way, a way that went below the surface of the particular conversations and the Thursday afternoons and the books she chose for him with such uncanny accuracy. He began to understand that what he felt for Delia Maddox was not the flaring, uncomfortable kind of feeling that he associated with brief encounters and traveling men, but something steadier and more serious, something with roots. It frightened him somewhat, because roots meant staying, and staying meant being seen, and being seen meant that eventually she would see the parts of him that he had not figured out how to explain. The war that lived inside him, the years of drifting that had left him uncertain about who he was when he was not working, the kneeling thing that he had told no one, and that he did not know how to put into words without sounding like a man who had let the war turn him strange. He went on reading her books and coming back on Thursdays and thinking about this, and the summer moved through August and into September, and Harlan's Crossing had its first real autumn rain, which turned the packed dirt street briefly into mud and brought out the smell of the earth the way rain always did in dry country, clean and almost grateful. One evening in September, returning from a long day of pushing cattle up from the southern pastures, Emmett stopped by the church reading room on an impulse that he did not fully examine. The door was open. Delia was there, but she was not alone. There was a woman with her, a stout and clearly agitated woman named Mrs. Harker, whose husband ran the tannery and who had opinions that she expressed at volume. Mrs. Harker was explaining, at significant volume, that she believed the lending library should not contain a particular novel that Delia had recently added to the collection, a novel by a woman writer that Mrs. Harker considered inappropriate for a church-affiliated institution. Emmett stood in the doorway. Delia's back was to him. Her shoulders were level, and her voice, when she spoke, was as calm as still water. She said that the reading room was a library for the benefit of the whole community, and that the purpose of a library was to make ideas available to people so that they could form their own judgments, and that she found it difficult to support the principle that one member of the community should decide which ideas were available to all the others. Mrs. Harker said that there were standards. Delia said that she agreed that there were, and that her standard was that any book that illuminated the human experience had a place in the collection. Mrs. Harker said that Delia's father would have seen things differently. There was a pause that had weight in it, and then Delia said, very quietly and very precisely, "My father taught me to love the truth, Mrs. Harker, and to believe that the truth could survive any examination. That is why I am not afraid of books." Mrs. Harker left shortly after, with the stiff spine of a woman who has not won the argument but is not quite ready to admit it. And she passed Emmett in the doorway without acknowledging him, and he stepped aside to let her pass, and then stepped into the reading room. Delia turned around and saw him, and her composure slipped for just a moment, not into distress, but into something more human, a flicker of the effort it had cost her to hold that conversation with such steadiness. "Good evening, Mr. Keene," she said. "Good evening," he said. He looked at her for a moment. "You are very good at that," he said. "At what?" "Holding your ground without making an enemy of it," he said. She considered this. "I am not sure I always succeed," she said. "Mrs. Harker is not entirely pleased with me." "Mrs. Harker is not someone who is easily pleased," he said. "I expect you know that." She smiled, and there it was again, the real one, and she said, "Would you sit for a moment? I have been wanting to ask you something." He sat down in the chair across from her small table, and she folded her hands and looked at him with the directness he had come to find both alarming and deeply appealing. "You have been coming here for 3 months," she said, "and you are a man who does not do things without reason, so I would like to ask you whether you are coming for the books." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Not entirely." "I thought not," she said. Her voice was even but not cool. "I wanted to ask because I think it is important to be honest about things rather than to let them go on indefinitely without being named." "That is fair," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Then I will tell you that I have found our Thursday afternoons to be the best part of my week," she said. "I have found that I think about you during the week when you are not here. I have found that I look forward to your return in a way that has nothing to do with the books." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he said, "I feel the same." She nodded once, as though they had confirmed a practical matter and could now proceed accordingly. But there was a brightness in her eyes that was not practical at all. "Good," she said. "Then perhaps we should not restrict ourselves to Thursday afternoons." He went back to the bunkhouse that evening, walking 3 inches above the ground, and Rodrigo, who was sitting on the step smoking, looked at him and said absolutely nothing and smiled into his pipe. What followed was a courtship that had the character of both participants purposeful and genuine, and not given to excess dramatics, but underneath the purposefulness as warm and alive as the late Texas summer. Emmett began to call on Delia at the small house behind the church where she lived, 2 rooms and a kitchen, and a back porch that looked out on a kitchen garden. She maintained with the same methodical care she gave to everything. He came in the evenings after the day's work, and she would have coffee made, and they would sit on the back porch or at the kitchen table and talk, and sometimes she would read to him while he repaired something that needed repairing around her house. She had accumulated a quiet backlog of small maintenance tasks that she had managed around with the practicality of a woman living alone, but had never quite gotten ahead of, and sometimes he would talk while she sewed. He told her about Louisiana gradually, in pieces, the way you hand things over carefully because they are fragile. He told her about his father first, and then about the early years of the war, and she listened without the reactions he had sometimes encountered from people. No sentimentality, no judgment, just attention. He told her about the kneeling, eventually. It took him until October to get to it, sitting on her back porch on a cool evening with the stars very bright and a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. He told her that after his father's funeral he had made a private vow not to kneel again, because kneeling had come to mean for him all the things the war had taken from him. The certainty, the youth, the particular feeling that things could be counted on to stay where you put them. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And then you knelt in the churchyard for a nail and a skirt hem." "Yes," he said. She looked at him in the dark, and the lamplight from the kitchen window fell across her face. "What was it like?" she said. He thought about it. "Different," he said. "It was different than all the other times. It did not feel like defeat." "What did it feel like?" He thought about it some more. "Like something I wanted to do," he said. She put her hand over his on the arm of the chair, and she did not say anything else, and he turned his hand over under hers and held on. October became November, and Harlan's Crossing settled into the mild Texas winter with its short cold spells and longer warm patches, the grass going dry and brown, and the longhorns moving down from the higher ground to the creek bottoms. Emmett's work on the Callaway Ranch shifted with the season to fence repair and equipment maintenance, and the particular careful boredom of winter ranch work, which was less dramatic than the summer driving, but in its own way just as constant. He and Delia saw each other 4 or 5 times a week. He brought her things, small things, practical things, because extravagance was not in his nature, and because he suspected she would find it suspicious. A new candle box because hers had broken, a particular kind of dried herb from a San Antonio market that Rodrigo had recommended for the headaches she occasionally mentioned, a length of good flannel fabric that he had spotted at the general store and thought would suit the winter she was heading into. She gave him things too. She gave him books, which was obvious, but she also gave him meals, which she cooked with the same competence she brought to everything else, and she gave him conversation that challenged him, and she gave him the particular gift of being seen clearly by someone who found what they saw worth keeping. He was not accustomed to that gift, and he accepted it with the careful gratitude of a man who knows he is receiving something valuable. In November she told him about the hardest years, after her mother had died when Delia was 16, and before her father's heart ailment had declared itself, when it had been just the two of them in the small house and the whole weight of the world had seemed very large, and the support structures very fragile. She told him with the directness she brought to everything, not asking for comfort but giving him information, the way she did with books, saying, "Here is what this contains." He listened, and when she was done he said, "You have been holding a great deal on your own for a long time." She looked at him in that steady way. "Yes," she said. "You do not have to any more," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Emmett." It was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. before it, and the way she said it, with care and with something underneath the care, was a thing he would remember for the rest of his life. He proposed to her on a Saturday in December, not with ceremony but with honesty, sitting at her kitchen table with their coffee going cold and the winter rain coming down outside, and he said that he loved her and that he wanted to marry her and that he understood if she needed time to think about it. She said she did not need time to think about it. She said yes. He kissed her for the first time in her small kitchen with the rain on the windows, and it was not an elegant or particularly graceful kiss, because they were both sitting at a table and the angle was awkward, and she laughed when it was done, which was the best possible response, and he laughed too, and the kitchen felt more full of light than the single lamp could account for. They were married in January of 1875, in the church that Delia had attended for 7 years, and that held her father's memory in its wooden beams. The preacher was a traveling minister named Reverend Horace Clay, who came through Harlan's Crossing every 6 weeks on his circuit, a cheerful elderly man with white whiskers who married and buried and baptized across a 50-mile stretch of Texas with equal goodwill toward all occasions. The whole town came, because in a small town a wedding was a civic event as much as a personal one, and because Delia Maddox was the kind of woman whose personal events the town felt it had a stake in. Rodrigo was there in a clean shirt that Emmett had not seen before, and Finn was there in full Irish voice, and even Chester came and sat in the second pew and wiped his eyes with a handkerchief at the moment when the vows were said, which surprised everyone who had assumed Chester had no lachrymose capacities. Hector Callaway came, and Abel Marsh the sheriff, and Aldous Webb from the feed store and Prentice from the copper kettle, and Mrs. Harker, who came to the wedding with the air of a woman who has decided to be magnanimous about a situation she has not entirely approved, and who should receive credit for this magnanimity. Delia received her with warmth and not a trace of irony, which was one of the things Emmett most admired about her. They married, and it was done, and it was real. Emmett moved into Delia's small house, which required some negotiation because the house was small, and he had the habits of a man who had lived in bunkhouses for years, and who took up physical space in a way he had never had to think about before. He was careful with her things, and she was patient with his adjustments, and within a month they had worked out the particular domestic geography of two people sharing a space, who made the coffee, and who banked the fire at night, and where things were kept, and what the sounds of each other in an ordinary morning sounded like. He continued working for Hector Calloway for several months, and then Calloway came to him in the spring with a proposition. There was a section of the Calloway property, 30 acres along the creek, with good grass and a small spring-fed stock tank, that Calloway was willing to sell to Emmett at a price he could reach if he put in most of his savings and worked out the remainder over the following 2 years. It was a real offer, from a man who had come to respect the quality of Emmett's work, and who understood what it meant to a man to have something of his own. Emmett talked to Delia about it that evening, laying out all the facts on the kitchen table between them, the price and the terms and what it would require of their savings and what it would mean for the next 2 years in terms of the tightness they would have to live with. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "Do you want it?" He said yes. She said, "Then we will work for it." It was as simple as that, and that simplicity was a thing he had not known he needed until he had it. The particular simplicity of being with someone who trusted your judgment and was willing to work beside you toward a shared thing. They bought the 30 acres and began. Emmett kept on part-time with Calloway while he built a small barn on their land, and then a fence line, and then started the slow accumulation of a small cattle herd, buying 1 or 2 animals at a time as they could afford them. Delia kept the lending library and her sewing and her reading students, and she also planted a larger kitchen garden and kept chickens, and on Saturdays she baked bread that she sold to 2 families in town who had ordered standing amounts. They worked, and they were careful with money, and they ate simply, and neither of them complained about any of it, which was perhaps the greatest compatibility of all. In the summer of 1875, a man came to Harlan's Crossing, who created some trouble of the kind that small towns in 1874 and 1875 Texas experienced periodically. A man named Garrett Sills, who had come down from North Texas, and who had a bad reputation, that arrived in town just slightly after he did, the way bad reputations did. Sills had been running a cattle borrowing operation north of there, which was the polite term for taking cattle that did not belong to you, and he had a habit of creating conflict at the Copper Kettle and making himself disagreeable to the local commerce. Sheriff Abel Marsh watched Sills for 3 weeks with the patience of a man who knows what he is looking at and is waiting for the right moment. And then, after an incident at the saloon in which Sills had broken a table and made threatening remarks to the bartender, Marsh arrested him with quiet efficiency and held him in the town jail until the circuit judge came through. The judge took a week, and during that week the town was somewhat tense, because Sills had made remarks about not intending to stay in jail that Marsh had responded to by deputizing 2 additional men, including Emmett. Emmett served as a temporary deputy for the 6 days before the judge arrived, which meant he spent more time in town and less on his land than was ideal, and he was frank about this cost when Delia asked him. But she was equally frank that having Abel Marsh's authority respected in Harlan's Crossing was important to the kind of town they wanted to live in, and she was right, which made it easier to sit with the inconvenience. The judge came, took the evidence, and sentenced Sills to 2 years in the Bixar County Jail. Sills went, and the Copper Kettle replaced its broken table, and Harlan's Crossing went back to its ordinary life with the particular relief of a place that has dealt with something unpleasant and put it behind it. Emmett went back to his land, and his cattle and his evenings with Delia, and everything settled. Their life together had a quality that Emmett had not previously known was possible, which was the quality of being both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. The ordinary part was the work and the meals, and the careful management of their limited finances, and the small repairs and the daily routines. The extraordinary part was harder to name, but was always present. It was in the way she still looked at him when he came in at the end of the day, with the direct attention of a woman who is genuinely glad to see a particular person. It was in the conversations they had at the kitchen table that went on long past when the lamp should have been put out. It was in the way she still chose books for him with uncanny accuracy, and the way she read his recommendations with equal care, and the way they talked about what they had read in a running conversation that went through their days like a thread. It was in the way he felt when he was with her, not the diminished, defended version of himself that he had carried for years, but something more complete, a man who had found the edges of himself and was comfortable within them. By the fall of 1875, their small herd had grown to 14 head, and the barn was solid, and they had paid off the first portion of the land debt to Callaway. Emmett was hired to take 3 of Callaway's cattle to a buyer in San Antonio for a cattle drive, a 3-day ride that was the longest he had been away from home since the wedding. He missed her with a specificity that surprised him, not the vague homesickness of his drifting years, but a particular, directed missing of this woman in this house, the sound of her moving in the kitchen and her voice in the evening, and the weight of her hand in his when they slept. He came back from San Antonio with the money for Callaway and a small package for Delia, a book he had found in a San Antonio bookseller's shop, a natural history of the wildflowers of the Texas Hill Country, illustrated with detailed drawings that he had known immediately she would love. She opened it at the kitchen table and went through it page by page without speaking, with the absorbed total attention she gave to things that mattered to her, and when she looked up her eyes were bright. "Emmett Keene," she said, "you know me." "I do," he said. She set the book down and came around the table and put her arms around him, and he held her, and they stood there in the kitchen for a long time without speaking. In the winter of 1875 going into 1876, Delia told him she was expecting a child. He was standing at the kitchen counter when she told him, cleaning his hands on a cloth after coming in from the barn, and he turned around and looked at her, and the look on her face was the quiet, steady version of her that he loved most, not performing an emotion but simply having one, clearly and without decoration. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and she laughed at the repetition, and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" She said she was feeling somewhat nauseated in the mornings but otherwise well, and that she had spoken with Mrs. Bayer, the town's midwife, who had confirmed the news and told her what to expect. He said, "A baby," she said, in approximately July. He sat down in the kitchen chair with the particular sudden heaviness of a man receiving very large news, and she sat across from him and folded her hands and watched him work through it, which she had learned was the right approach with him, to give him space to process rather than to fill the space. After a moment he said, "I did not think I would have this. A child." She said, "Any of this," he said. He looked at her. "After the war I did not think I would have anything worth having. I was not planning past the next season. I was not planning at all." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "And now I am planning for a long time," he said. The news spread through Harlan's Crossing with the particular speed of small-town information, and the response from the community was warm and practical. Mrs. Bayer made a check-in call. Several women brought food. Rodrigo appeared at their door one evening with a cradle he had made himself from cedar wood, sanded smooth and polished, which Emmett could not respond to without embarrassment, and Delia responded to by hugging Rodrigo, who turned red to his collar and looked enormously pleased. Finn began telling everyone at the Copper Kettle that he had known from the first that those two were meant for each other, which was an exaggeration of his actual foreknowledge, but was delivered with such conviction that no one challenged it. The spring of 1876 was good to them. The cattle herd had grown to 22 head, which was a real operation beginning to assert itself. Delia's garden expanded across the whole backyard. her kitchen filled with preserves and dried herbs. Her library acquired 12 new volumes from a donation by a San Antonio family, whose matriarch had heard about the lending room through Reverend Clay. Emmett finished paying off the land debt to Calloway a full 4 months ahead of schedule, which Calloway accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has made a good bet and watched it pay out. On a warm Tuesday in late July of 1876, Delia gave birth to their son. It was a hard day, the kind that tested everyone in the room, and Mrs. Bayer was steady and capable throughout, and Emmett sat outside the door of their bedroom for several hours with his hat in his hands and his heart somewhere up in his throat. And when the sound of crying from inside changed from one voice to two, he closed his eyes and sat still for a long moment. The boy was healthy and strong, with Delia's gray-green eyes and a substantial voice, and they named him Samuel, for Delia's father. She lay in the bed with the baby in her arms and looked up at Emmett when he came in, and she was so tired and so radiant that he could barely look at her directly, the way you could not look directly at something very bright. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on the boy's back, small and warm and impossibly alive under his palm. "Samuel Keene," he said, trying the name. "Samuel Keene," she confirmed. He looked up at her and said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Thank you." She said, "We did this together," which was the exact right thing to say. Samuel was a vigorous baby who ate enthusiastically and slept in unpredictable stretches, and regarded the world with the expression of someone conducting an ongoing investigation. Emmett learned over the first weeks the particular competence of new parenthood, the night feedings and the swaddling and the careful support of a head that had not yet figured out its own weight, with the same methodical attention he brought to learning any new skill, and Delia watched him and said, "You are going to be very good at this." He said he was not sure about that. She said she was. She was right. The years that followed had the quality of good years, not without difficulty, because difficulty was part of the work and the weather and the economics of a small cattle operation in 1870s Texas, but with a fundamental rightness that held through the difficulties the way the frame of a well-built house holds through weather. In 1877 they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara, after the wildflower in Delia's Hill Country book, the Clarkia, which she had once pointed to and called beautiful and told him a story about. Clara was different from Samuel in temperament, quieter and more observant, with Emmett's dark brown hair and the kind of focused attention that her mother recognized and named very early as a reading disposition. By the time she was 3, she was spending long minutes with books in her lap, turning the pages with care, examining the illustrations with a seriousness that made her parents exchange smiles across the room. Samuel, by contrast, was already showing a strong preference for the outdoors and the animals and the particular freedom of open land, which Emmett recognized with a deep, quiet pleasure. He began teaching his son about the cattle and the land with the same patient methodology that Rodrigo had used with horses, showing him things slowly and letting him ask questions, and not pretending that he had all the answers when he did not. Harlan's Crossing in the late 1870s was a town in the process of changing, slowly and unevenly. The railroad came within 40 miles in 1878, which changed the economics of cattle driving considerably, and also meant that mail and goods moved faster, and the isolation of the town, which had always been its defining condition, began to ease at its edges. Delia's lending library grew. She added a new shelf every year and found donors with increasing success, and she began corresponding with a librarian in San Antonio who sent her recommendations and occasionally actual books, which arrived on the new stage line with the particular thrill of things coming from a distance. She also, in 1878, started a formal school. She had been teaching reading informally for years, but the town had no real schoolhouse, and after a long campaign of quiet advocacy, which meant a great many conversations with the town council, with Reverend Clay, and with individual families, conducted with the persistence and good-natured precision that characterized everything Delia did. She secured a small building on the edge of the church property, and enough donations to furnish it with benches and a chalkboard, and a supply of the most basic school materials. Emmett built the bookshelves for the school, working in the evenings with his saw and hammer, and the particular satisfaction of a man making something that will be used and needed. He was not a gifted carpenter by training, but he was careful and he measured twice, and he was stubborn about getting things level. And when the shelves were done, Delia ran her hand along the smooth wood and said, "They are perfect." He said they were not exactly perfect, pointing out a join at the far end that was not quite as tight as he had wanted. She said, "They are perfect for their purpose, which is the better kind of perfect." He thought about that for a while, standing in the new schoolroom with the smell of wood shavings and chalk, and he thought that she was right, and that being right about that kind of thing was one of the many ways she had made his life larger than it had been before he knew her. By 1879, there were 14 children enrolled in the school, which was everyone in the relevant age range within a 5-mile radius. Delia taught 5 days a week and maintained the library and still took in some sewing, though less of it now, and she was manifestly the most important civic institution in Harlan's Crossing after the water supply, a fact that the town council had finally acknowledged by paying her a small formal salary for the school, which had required 2 years of advocacy, but which she had pursued with patient certainty. Their cattle operation had grown to 45 head by 1879. Emmett had hired a part-time hand, a young man named Wees who was 19 and hardworking, and who reminded Emmett of himself at that age in ways that were both encouraging and somewhat alarming. He taught Wees the work with care, the way Rodrigo had taught him, with patience and the expectation of real competence. Rodrigo had left the Callaway Ranch in 1877 to go back to his family in South Texas, and Emmett had said goodbye to him, with the particular emotion of saying goodbye to a man who had been quietly essential, without demanding recognition for it. They had shaken hands in the yard of the Callaway Ranch on a morning in April, and Rodrigo had said, "Take care of that library woman," and Emmett had said he intended to, and Rodrigo had smiled the smile he had been smiling since the very beginning, the one that knew everything and ridden south. Hector Callaway retired in 1880, selling the ranch to a syndicate from San Antonio, and the character of the operation changed considerably, as it always did when a family ranch became a business. Emmett was glad of his own 30 acres, expanded now to 45 through 2 careful purchases, his own ground under his own name. In 1880, Delia was expecting again, and this pregnancy was harder than the first 2, with a period in the 5th month that frightened both of them and required 3 days of rest and Mrs. Bayer's steady presence. The difficulty passed, and in March of 1881 she gave them a second son, whom they named Joseph, and who arrived in the world as healthy and loud as his brother had been, with considerably more red in his hair than either parent could immediately account for, which Delia solved by pointing out that her grandmother had been red-haired, a piece of family history that Emmett had not previously known and found delightful. Joseph was born into a house that was now full 3 children, 2 parents, the animals in the barn, the books everywhere, the garden out back and the lamp lit in the evenings, and the sound of children's voices in the morning. Emmett sat in the kitchen one evening in the spring of 1881, with Samuel doing his letters at one end of the table, and Clara looking at her mother's Hill Country Wildflower book, with the focus of a child reading scripture and Delia nursing baby Joseph in the chair by the window. And he looked at all of it and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. He thought about the churchyard in June of 1874. The nail in the fence post and the fabric caught and the mud on his knee and the touch of her hand at his elbow afterward, so brief and so exact. He thought about what he had told her, that it did not feel like defeat. He thought it had been the beginning of everything, that moment on his knee in the mud, the moment when the vow he had made at his father's grave had broken open and let something in. He had said he would never kneel for anything again after the war, and he had meant it as a declaration of survival, of refusal, of the particular pride of a man who has been brought low and is determined not to be brought low again. And he had kept the vow for years, held it like a piece of himself that nothing could touch. And then the nail had caught her hem, and he had been down in the mud before he had finished thinking about it, and the world had not ended. The ground had not swallowed him. The defeat had not arrived. What had arrived was Delia Maddox looking down at him with those gray-green eyes and everything that came after. He looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked up from the baby and saw him looking, and she gave him the real smile, the one that had first arrived on Founder's Day and had never in all the years since changed its quality. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "A fence nail," he said. She laughed, soft and clear. "That fence nail," she said. "That fence nail," he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment with all the knowledge of 7 years in her eyes, all the books and the Thursday afternoons and the land debt paid off and the children and the school and the mornings and the evenings and everything in between, and she said, "I never thanked you properly for that." "You married me," he said. "That was fairly comprehensive." She shifted the baby to her other arm and held out her free hand across the table, and he reached across and took it. And held on the way he had the first time on the back porch in the autumn dark, with the same certainty and the same gratitude and something else that had grown in the years between a love that had settled into the bones of things, not the bright flaring beginning kind, but the kind that was woven into the ordinary hours, into the sound of his name in her voice, and the books on the shelves, and the children at the table, and the cattle in the pasture, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life being lived. Samuel looked up from his letters and looked at his parents holding hands across the table and said, with the frankness of a 7-year-old, "Why are you holding hands?" Emmett said. "Because I want to." Samuel accepted this and went back to his letters. Clara did not look up from her wildflower book. Joseph made a small sound of contentment against his mother's side. The lamp burned steady. Outside, the Texas evening was settling into dark, and the cattle were moving along the creek bed, and the stars were coming out over Harlan's Crossing the way they did every night, in their multitudes, indifferent to human lives but somehow presiding over them anyway. And the town went on with the lives of all the people in it, Abel Marsh making his last round of the evening, Prentice closing up the copper kettle. The new families who had come in on the railroad and the old families who had been there since the cattle trail, and somewhere in the south, Rodrigo looking at his own stars. The spring of 1883 came with the particular sweetness of springs in that part of Texas, the brief window when the land was green and the air was neither cold nor cruel, and the wildflowers that Delia had been cataloging against her hill country book were everywhere along the roadsides and the creek banks. Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets and the delicate white blooms she had shown Clara how to identify, kneeling in the grass together with the book between them, mother and daughter. Heads bent over a page and then bent together over the real thing. Samuel was 8 and spending every possible hour with Wheeze and the cattle, absorbing knowledge the way he absorbed everything fast and with the thoroughness of a child who does not know how to be superficial about anything that interests him. Clara was 6 and had developed opinions about books that she expressed with a clarity that made Emmett laugh and Delia look proud. Joseph was 2 and conducting a thorough investigation of the world by putting his hands on everything within reach. The lending library in the back of the church had, by 1883, grown to 430 volumes, which required an additional bookcase and a reorganization of the whole room that Delia undertook in April with Emmett's help, the two of them moving books in stacks and arguing pleasurably about the best way to arrange a section of overlapping subjects while the children played outside in the churchyard. When they were done and the room was put right and all the books were in their new places, Delia stood in the center of the room and looked around at the shelves with the expression she had when she was genuinely satisfied with something, which was quiet and complete and not given to exclamation. Emmett was leaning against the doorframe watching her. "It is good," she said. "It is very good," he said. "Your father would have liked it." She turned and looked at him, and her eyes went to that particular quality that happened when she was moved by something and managing it with her usual steadiness. "Yes," she said, "he would have." She crossed the room and stood in front of him in the doorway, and he straightened up from the frame, and she looked at him with everything in her face, the intelligence and the directness and the humor and the love that was the deepest layer, the one that had always been the truest part. She said, "Emmett Keene, do you know what I think about that evening in the churchyard?" "I know what I think about it," he said. "I think that was the moment everything was decided," she said. "Before any conversation. Before the lending library and the Founder's Day and the lemonade. Before all of it, just that. You going down in the mud without thinking about it." He looked at her steadily. "I had told myself I would never kneel again," he said. "It had been a whole thing in my head." "I know," she said. "You told me. And then there was the nail and you were stuck and I went down before I had finished deciding anything," he said. She reached up and put her palm against his face, warm and sure, the way she had always touched him, with the same directness she brought to everything, nothing held back, nothing performed. "Do you know what that tells me?" she said. "What?" "That the truest part of you was already there," she said. "The part that kneels for a reason worth kneeling for. All that time you thought you had put it away, it was just waiting." He covered her hand with his, holding it against his face, and looked at her in the afternoon light of the lending library with the books all around them, and the sound of the children outside and the smell of cedar wood and old paper. And he felt the same thing he had felt that first evening on the back porch when she had held out her hand in the dark, the absolute certainty of something right. He said, "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." She said, "We are the best thing that has ever happened to either of us." He kissed her there in the doorway of the reading room, with the books as witnesses, and she kissed him back with the fullness of a woman who means what she does. And when they separated, she was smiling, the real one, and she said, "Now, let us go get the children before Joseph tries to climb the fence again." He laughed and she took his hand and they went out into the spring afternoon, into the bright grass and the wildflowers, and the sound of Samuel calling instructions to someone across the churchyard, with the confident authority of a boy who intends to be good at whatever he puts himself to. And Clara sitting under the oak tree with her mother's Hill Country book in her lap, identifying something in the grass with careful precision. And Joseph standing at the fence in the posture of a child who has just decided the fence is climbable and is working up to the attempt. Emmett crossed the churchyard in 4 strides and scooped Joseph up from the fence before the attempt could become an incident, and Joseph grabbed his father's hat with the single-minded joy of a 2-year-old who has never found a hat that did not need removing, and Delia laughed from across the yard and said, "He is exactly like you when he fixes on something." "He is exactly like you," Emmett said, settling the boy on his hip and retrieving his hat and setting it back on his head at a crooked angle that Joseph immediately corrected by pushing it sideways again. "He is exactly like himself," Delia said, coming to stand beside them, and she took Joseph's hand and he stopped fussing with the hat long enough to regard his mother with the serious affection of someone who has made a decision about a person and is at peace with it. Emmett looked at his wife standing in the spring sun, holding their youngest son's hand, the grass going green around them and the books waiting inside and the cattle in the pasture beyond the church fence, and he thought about all the kneeling he had done in his life, in the war and after it, and at his father's grave, and in this very churchyard, and he thought that the last one was the one that mattered. The one in the mud with her skirt caught on a nail and him going down without deciding to, the one that had been the beginning of everything worth having. He had said he would never kneel again, and then he had for her without even the dignity of making a choice about it, and it had turned out to be the most important thing he had ever done. He had not been brought low by it. He had been brought home. The years ahead of them stretched out in his mind not as an uncertain thing, but as a known country, not every detail mapped, because no life was that neat, but the essential shape of it clear. The cattle and the land and the school and the books and the children growing up in this place, where the grass went brown in summer and green in spring, and the water ran in the creek, and the stars were very bright. More Thursday conversations that had long since expanded to fill the whole week. More evenings with coffee on the back porch, and the lamplight from the kitchen window and her voice in the dark, telling him things that no one else knew, receiving in return the things he had thought he could not tell anyone. Samuel would learn the cattle and the land and carry Emmett's stubbornness and Delia's precision in some combination that would be entirely his own. Clara would read everything she could get her hands on and have opinions about all of it, and she would eventually do something with those opinions that would make both her parents very proud and would not require their prediction to confirm it. Joseph would climb everything, and they would worry about him, and he would land on his feet because he had both of them in him. The town would change, as towns did, and the railroad would eventually come closer, and the world outside would press in with its news and its changes, and some of those changes would be hard and some would be welcome, and they would face all of it the way they faced everything together and honest and not without difficulty, but with the underlying conviction that the difficulty could be met. Emmett had come to Harlan's Crossing with nothing but a saddle and a set of working skills, and a vow that had seemed like survival, but had actually been a wall he had built around himself. And Delia Maddox had come to the general store with a paper-wrapped package and a frown over a shopping list, and a nail on a fence post in a churchyard, had done what all the deliberate plans and careful protections in the world could not. It had brought him to his knee, and in doing so had returned him to himself. He reached over with his free hand and found Delia's free hand and held it. She squeezed back, once firmly, the way she had the first time. Across the churchyard, Clara looked up from her wildflower book and saw her parents holding hands, and she looked at them with the considering expression of a 6-year-old who is cataloging information for future reference. And then she looked back down at her book and went on identifying the small white flowers in the spring grass with the same careful attention she had always given to things worth knowing. The sun went on across the Texas sky, and Harlan's Crossing went on in its living, and Emmett Keene stood in the churchyard with his wife's hand in his and their children around him and his ground under his feet, and he was home, and the long drifting was over, and everything was exactly as it should be, and would go on being so.